Hello, Coach Gary here. I just want to have a little bit of a discussion slash rant about some stuff I've been thinking about in terms of route setting. So I've been trawling the YouTubes in ISO and came across this channel called Holistic Songwriting, and it's all about different strategies we can use to write better songs. But I took a lot away from it in terms of how we can affect our customers when we're setting routes, and the way that a song builds tension, anticipation, and manipulates emotions. How those same processes, maybe we can bring them into route setting. So the dude is Friedemann, and he wrote a book called The Addiction Formula. And yeah, I guess addiction is what we're looking for with our clients. We really want people to fall in love with them or hate them, but want to come back. And that's I guess the main thing. That's how you know if a route is good or not, is if customers want to keep doing it. And the way you construct a song or write a song is quite similar to the way you iteratively put up a climb. Like you have a first draft, you polish it, you come back to it, you get feedback. It's personal, it's creative, you get obsessed, you get frustrated. I saw a lot of parallels there. So just like with songwriting, route setting has many different elements. You could think about, we've got different wall angles, different holds, different styles, and you may have several different moves you want to do in a route. You might want to change how the difficulty goes. You might want to think about safety, sketchiness, reachiness, all of these little things that we can pay attention to, like aesthetic, all of that. Those different elements end up competing, and it's hard to know what to prioritize. In holistic songwriting, what's important is to decide on a governing principle, and this will help you structure the route of the song. You need something to lead the decision-making process. Otherwise, there's decision paralysis. There's too many options. And what this does is it ends up giving us a more coherent product, where we can really focus on one thing, and then everything else will be based around that factor. Then the elements can work together rather than competing against each other, the result of which is often that we end up with a whole bunch of different disparate ideas or things that come across as a bit random, or we actually set the bottom, for example, and then change everything. We'll set the bottom, get that perfect, and then set the next section, try to get that perfect, but that means we have to change the bottom. So then the bottom gets compromised to fit the next section. And then we set the third section on top, which again will end up tweaking the second section, and so on and so on. And then, so each iterative part actually dilutes the previous parts, and the whole thing is compromised, trying to satisfy too many variables. But if we have one sort of leading focus that everything else gets changed around, at least there's something that we'll end up getting one thing right, and it'll be a lot less stressful, I think, on the setter. So we want to avoid having a random collection of ideas, and we don't want to be too scared to deviate from each one of those random ideas. A lot of the time that happens where you'll fall in love with your first move, and it'll make it really hard to set anything else. It doesn't fit with the space you have on the wall, or the wall angle, or the holds you happen to have. Whereas if you understand the whole picture, all the components, and you decide on the vague structure to begin with, and what the overall sort of story is going to be, then we can start to do the little things. But yeah, if you let the little things control the whole thing, it ends up being a bit of a mess. The second interesting part is staying gefährlich. Gefährlich? I'm certainly saying that wrong. So that's German and roughly translates to sound dangerous, which in this context doesn't mean like risky or hazardous to the customer, but more about being compelling or edgy, and in a subtle way. I think what we really want is to create climbs that are attractive to the customer and have some sort of memorable edge to them. Something that you can identify that climb from the others. And I think when you're route setting in a team, especially, being able to discuss and put into words what your idea is and why the customer will appreciate it is really important. And trying to be excited about why you want to make something, like what's special about this climb. Like I think as a route setter, as soon as you're bored, like there's something wrong. So for this, there are two parts, and one is the gratification, and the second part is the anticipation, the waiting, the low energy part, and the tension before the high energy hook, the hype. You need both to really get that addictive sort of brain chemistry going, according to the addiction formula. So the key to this is a balance between repetition and change. So on one hand, if you repeat too often, it could be boring, but it might be more memorable. But if you change too often, maybe it'll be more interesting, but it also could come across as convoluted. And I know I experience that a lot with my route setting, where I want to create something that's high in complexity, hard to read, and the customers just get confused and often read it wrong, do some really random, awful, gnarly thing, or just leave it because they can't see it yet. So some sort of balance in between there, where ideally you want to be getting that interesting and memorable balance. So one tip they talk about is the rule of threes, and you might have heard about that before in like comedy writing, like the bait and switch, where you have introduction, repetition, and the third part is where it changes. It's a surprise. And I guess in route setting, especially for a long route, you can do this where, I often find I'll do a introduction sort of sit start, the crux in the middle, and then often the outro of a climb is hard to think of how to make that interesting. And I think going back to subtlety, we can make things interesting for the customer without having to do another rad crazy move. Just switching up the style, or just adding like a variation on the elements that happened before can not necessarily increase the difficulty, but mix things up. So going back to that mix between anticipation and gratification, that anticipation time, that tension time, can be really interesting. Like in a song, you have changes in tension, like a building tension, a jump from low intensity to high intensity, or the drop where it builds up to high and then suddenly goes down to zero. This really builds anticipation, and you feel it when you're listening to music. And I wonder whether something like that can exist with route setting too, with like the hold intensity, the physical intensity or the complexity. We can play with that. We can make slower paced sections and fast explosive sections, just by playing with the footholds and balance, and making something delicate and then suddenly making them have to explode, or interacting with that curve of energy could be really interesting. And we can do it in an unsatisfying way too. They talk about the false promise, which is where energy builds up, it comes down, and there's no payoff. Finally, he talks about his process for constructing a song. And that's really interesting for root setting too, because there's so many different ways to set a root, but having some sort of structure that will help you sort of go quickly and without going in circles is really helpful. So first off, he proposes you just start writing a song, and I think it works the same with root setting. You just have a vague idea, throw something up, and then see what you have. So trying to be too contrived and trying to aim for some particular thing too hard, you might just end up with something, which is cool. And then once you've identified what that something is, that's what you should probably run with for time efficiency. Then try to figure out what the energy curve of it is. And I don't know if this really applies to root setting, but the idea here is that you figure out where the sort of the hype or the high energy portions of the climb are, and I guess that means the crux. Is there one crux? Does it start off hard? Sting in the tail, like what's it going to look like? And then you've got this sort of rough outline, your structure, your shape of it. And then we can start to go in and play with little things, like introduce tension, you know, like, okay, there's a bit leading up to the crux, maybe we'll make it a bit bandory, off balance feet or something like that to dial in, you know, just a little bit more interest for the customer. And the same for, like, you know, do we want to give them a little bit of a jug to slow things down before the next section, or is it sustained? And then to test it and to take away any bits that are sluggish or that don't quite fit, that are boring. And I think if you have the overall structure and the main idea at the beginning, it's less likely that you're going to have these aberrant things at the end, and you can just print them off much more easily if you know what you want to keep, what's important to the root. And if you if you fall in love with like every little bit of the root, you won't be able to decide which parts you have to get rid of. And it's impossible to make 6, you know, really cool moves in the space of like, you know, 2 meters really, without them all sort of compromising each other. So yeah, I mean, so I just wanted to have a bit of a rant about what's been on my mind with root setting. I was really inspired by this stuff it's not about climbing, but it, you know, makes you think about, you know, puzzles and writing, creativity. I'd love to hear what you guys think, and I'm sure a lot of people think that setting's just setting, and it's not storytelling, and it's not songwriting, and you just put up the root, and that's great. And I'd love to hear how that works out for you, and yeah, get your feedback. So yeah, let us know down below, and yeah, let us know if you've got anything that's inspired you or really helped you to keep your roots on track, or things that the customers have really enjoyed. Cool. So thank you for your time.